Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and your gas station has a sign outside that reads just 2 words: no fuel. Not because of a storm, not because of a workers' strike, not because of a pipeline accident somewhere in your state, but because somewhere on the other side of the world, 12,000 miles away from where you are standing right now, a narrow strip of water, just 21 miles wide at its most narrow point, has been effectively shut down. And with that single waterway closed, approximately 20% of the entire world's daily oil supply has simply stopped moving, stopped flowing, stopped reaching the refineries that turn it into the gasoline in your car, the jet fuel in the planes above your head, the heating oil in your home, and the diesel that moves every single product you have ever purchased from a warehouse to a store shelf. That is not a hypothetical. That is not the plot of a Netflix thriller. That is the exact reality the world woke up to on the morning of March 2nd, 2026. And the man sitting at the absolute center of this storm, the man whose decisions in the next 72 hours could determine whether your grocery bill doubles, whether your pension fund collapses, whether the global economy tips into a recession that economists are already comparing to 2008, is Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, MBS. But here's the thing that every major news network is getting wrong about this story. MBS is not simply a victim in this crisis. He is not just a Gulf leader watching helplessly as a war explodes around him and hoping Washington protects him. He is a player, a calculated, strategic, extraordinarily deliberate player who has been positioning himself for exactly this kind of moment for years. And by the time this video is over, you're going to understand precisely how he got here, what he is actually doing right now behind the scenes, and why the move he makes in the next few days could either pull the global economy back from the edge or push it off entirely. Stay with me. Because what Iran did in the Strait of Hormuz in the last 10 days is unlike anything the world has seen in the modern energy era. The full picture of what is happening has not been told in one place, and we are going to tell it right now. But to understand where we are, you need to understand how fast and how terrifyingly we got here. Rewind to February 28th, 2026. That date will be remembered by historians. In the early hours of that morning, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes against Iran in an operation designated Operation Epic Fury. The targets were Iranian military facilities, nuclear sites, missile launch infrastructure, and Iranian leadership. Within the first hours of the operation, Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei was killed. The man who had led the Islamic Republic for over 3 decades, the ideological backbone of the entire Iranian revolutionary system, was gone. And the world held its breath waiting to see what came next. What came next was not what anyone fully expected. Iran did not simply fire missiles at Israel and call it even. Iran did not limit its retaliation to the parties who had directly attacked it. Instead, Iran executed a response that its military planners had clearly been preparing for a long time. A response designed not to win a direct military exchange with the most powerful air force on Earth, but to make every single country on Earth feel the pain of what the United States and Israel had done. Iran turned the keys on the Strait of Hormuz, and in doing so, it triggered a chain of events that is reshaping the global economy in real time, every single hour of every single day, right now as you watch this. Let us make sure you understand exactly what the Strait of Hormuz is and why closing it is one of the most powerful economic weapons any nation has ever deployed. Picture the Persian Gulf as an enormous bathtub filled with the world's most valuable liquid. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain all sit around the edges of that bathtub. Every barrel of oil they produce, every cubic meter of natural gas they liquefy, has to exit through one single drain. The Strait of Hormuz is that drain. It sits between Iran on one side and Oman and the UAE on the other. At its narrowest point, it is 21 miles wide. The actual shipping lanes within it are just 2 miles wide in each direction, 2 miles. For context, that is roughly the width of a mid-sized city. Through those 2 narrow lanes, day after day, year after year, approximately 20 million barrels of crude oil flowed in 2024, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. That is roughly 20% of the world's total daily oil supply. And on top of that oil, roughly 19% of global liquefied natural gas shipments, the natural gas that heats European homes, powers Japanese factories, and generates electricity across South Korea, also moves through that same narrow stretch of water. The U.S. Energy Information Administration values the energy trade passing through the Strait of Hormuz at approximately $500 billion annually, per year, $500 billion of energy flowing through a channel you could swim across on a calm day. This is why military strategists have called the Strait of Hormuz the single most critical energy choke point on the surface of the planet. Not one of the most critical, the most critical. And now Iran had effectively closed it. But here's the part of the story that is genuinely brilliant in its strategic design and genuinely terrifying in its implications. Iran did not close the strait the way military planners in Washington had spent 20 years preparing for. They did not mine the shipping lanes. They did not position warships to physically block the passage. They did not fire anti-ship missiles at every vessel that tried to cross. What they did was something far cheaper, far harder to counter, and far more effective. They deployed drones, and they used those drones to make the strait dangerous enough that the insurance industry did the rest of the work for them. As Halima Croft, head of global commodity strategy at RBC Capital Markets, put it, and this quote is critical to understanding everything that follows, all Iran had to do was several drone strikes in the vicinity of the strait, and insurers and shipping companies decided it was unsafe to traverse that very narrow waterway. She called it, precisely, an insurance-driven shutdown, and it has caught not just the markets off guard. It has caught the White House off guard too. Think about what that means for a moment. Iran produces approximately 10,000 drones per month. 10,000, each one costs a fraction of what a single oil tanker is worth. The International Group of Protection and Indemnity Clubs, which insures roughly 90% of the world's ocean-going tonnage, relies on reinsurance markets to absorb catastrophic risk. When those reinsurance markets look at the Strait of Hormuz and see active drone attacks on commercial vessels, they pull their coverage. And when the coverage disappears, the ships stop moving. Not because anyone is physically blocking them, but because no rational ship owner is going to send a vessel worth hundreds of millions of dollars, loaded with cargo worth tens of millions more, and carrying a crew of 20 or 30 human beings through a waterway where coverage is unavailable and attack is a genuine probability. The logic is simple. The effect is total. And the United States Navy, for all its extraordinary power, cannot insure oil tankers. It cannot undo the calculation that every shipping executive on Earth is making right now. By March 2nd, the IRGC, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, officially confirmed that the strait was closed and threatened any ship that attempted to transit it. The benchmark freight rate for very large crude carriers, the supertankers that moved 2 million barrels of oil from the Middle East to China in a single voyage, hit an all-time record of $423,736 per day, according to LSEG data. That was a 94% increase in a single day. 94% in a single day. The major insurers, Norway's Guard and Skjold, Britain's North Standard, the London P&I Club, the New York-based American Club, all began scrapping war risk coverage for vessels in the Persian Gulf. One by one, the shipping giants followed. Maersk, the Danish company that is widely regarded as a barometer of global trade, suspended cargo acceptance in and out of the United Arab Emirates. MSC followed. Hapag-Lloyd followed. CMA CGM followed. Japan's NYK Line, Mitsui OSK Lines, and Kawasaki Kisen all halted Hormuz operations simultaneously, and within 48 hours, at least 150 crude oil tankers and LNG carriers had dropped anchor in open Gulf waters beyond the strait, clustered in holding patterns off the coasts of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Qatar, and the UAE. 150 vessels, carrying fuel that the world desperately needed, going nowhere. Traffic through the Strait of Hormuz dropped 70% almost immediately. Then it approached zero. By March 7th, maritime intelligence firm Windward recorded a total of just 3 crossings through the entire strait in a single day. 3, on a waterway that normally sees dozens of transits daily. The world's most critical energy choke point had gone, in the span of 1 week, from being the pulse of the global energy system to being effectively a dead zone. And while the ships sat at anchor and the markets convulsed, something else was happening across the Gulf that most people were not paying close enough attention to. Iran was not simply closing the strait. Iran was simultaneously launching a coordinated campaign of drone and missile strikes against the energy infrastructure of every Gulf country that it viewed as complicit in the American and Israeli attack. And here is where the story of MBS, of Mohammed bin Salman and his extraordinary, dangerous, pivotal position in this crisis, truly begins. Because on the morning of March 2nd, 2 Iranian drones flew toward Ras Tanura. Say that name out loud and remember it, because it is one of the most important pieces of infrastructure in the entire global economy. Ras Tanura. It sits on the eastern coast of Saudi Arabia, right on the shore of the Persian Gulf. It is Saudi Aramco's largest domestic oil refinery. It processes more than 500,000 barrels of crude oil every single day. It is one of the most strategically critical single facilities anywhere on the planet. If Ras Tanura stops, Saudi Arabia's ability to export refined petroleum products stops with it. According to the Saudi Defense Ministry, both drones were intercepted. A limited fire resulted from falling shrapnel during the interception, according to the official statement, with no civilian casualties. But Aramco shut the refinery down anyway, not because it was destroyed, but out of security concerns. And that shutdown sent oil prices jumping further, because the markets understood what the attack represented, even if the physical damage was contained. Iran had targeted the crown jewel of Saudi Arabia's energy export infrastructure. It had demonstrated the capability and the willingness to reach inside the kingdom's most fortified energy complex and make it burn. And Ras Tanura was not the only target. Across the same 48-hour window, Iranian strikes hit energy and military infrastructure in Bahrain, Kuwait, the UAE, and Qatar. The Ras Laffan Industrial City in Qatar, the largest LNG processing complex in the world, the facility responsible for most of Qatar's enormous natural gas exports, was struck. Qatar moved immediately to declare force majeure on its gas contracts. Force majeure, the legal declaration that says circumstances beyond our control make it impossible to fulfill our obligations. When Qatar declares force majeure on LNG contracts, the energy supply chains of Japan, South Korea, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom all feel it instantly and simultaneously. Now pause here for a moment, because this is the precise point at which the economic consequences of this conflict stopped being about geopolitical risk premiums in oil futures markets, elevated prices that traders assigned to the possibility that something bad might happen, and started being about actual physical supply disruption. Oil that is not moving, gas that is not flowing, tankers that are anchored, refineries that are shut down, storage tanks in Iraq that are filling up because there is nowhere to send the oil, with Iraqi officials telling Reuters by March 4th that the country had already cut production by 1.5 million barrels per day simply because it was running out of storage capacity with the strait closed. That is a real number. 1.5 million barrels per day of Iraqi production gone, not because of military strikes, not because of sanctions, but because the outlet through which it had to flow was closed and there was literally nowhere to put the oil. And oil that cannot leave cannot be sold, and oil that cannot be sold means revenue that does not arrive. And revenue that does not arrive means government budgets that cannot be funded. In a country like Iraq, which depends on oil for more than 90% of its government revenue, that is an existential crisis that begins unfolding within days. The global price response was immediate, severe, and in the eyes of many analysts, still understated relative to what is coming if this situation does not resolve quickly. Brent crude, the global benchmark, surged 22% in the first week. U.S. crude oil prices rose 28% to above $86 per barrel within days of the strike's beginning. J.P. Morgan's head of global commodities research, Natasha Kaneva, warned in a Sunday note that if tankers remained penned in the Gulf and storage capacity in the producing countries was exhausted, forcing a production shutdown, Brent could spike above $120 per barrel. Bob McNally, president of Rapid Energy Group, said Iran had sufficient industrial capacity to produce 10,000 drones per month, and that it did not need to win a naval battle to keep the strait closed. It just needed to maintain enough threat to keep insurers from covering vessels. And, as he put it with brutal precision, it is enough for Tehran to demonstrate that it can sink several oil tankers and fear will do the rest. Natural gas prices in Europe surged to levels not seen since the worst days of the Russian energy crisis, following the Ukraine invasion. Electricity prices in Germany spiked by 40% in a single trading session. The Nikkei in Japan fell 3% on the first trading day after the strikes. South Korea's Kospi dropped sharply. Asian markets broadly sold off as investors processed what a sustained Hormuz closure would mean for an entire region that depends on Gulf energy to keep its factories running, its power grids functioning, and its economies growing. And every analyst on Wall Street in the City of London and in the major financial centers of Asia was staring at the same number and arriving at the same terrifying conclusion. OPEC Plus, the coalition of oil-producing nations led by Saudi Arabia and Russia, retains approximately 3.5 million barrels per day of spare production capacity. But here is the brutal irony at the heart of the crisis. Almost all of that spare capacity sits in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the same two countries that Iran has been actively striking with drones and missiles. And even if those barrels could be produced, they cannot reach global markets if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, because the only alternative pipeline routes out of the Gulf, the Trans-Arabian pipeline to Yanbu on the Red Sea with a capacity of 5 million barrels per day, and the UAE's Habshan-Fujairah pipeline with a capacity of around 1.5 million barrels per day, can together handle maybe 6 or 7 million barrels per day at best, against the 17 to 20 million barrels per day that normally flow through the strait. The math does not work. The alternative infrastructure does not exist to replace what the strait carries, and the world built itself into this dependency over decades, betting that the strait would always be open, that the risk was manageable, that deterrence would hold. That bet is now being stress-tested in real time. OPEC Plus met on March 1st and announced a production increase of 206,000 barrels per day for April. The announcement was designed to calm markets. It did not. As Jorge Leon, head of geopolitical analysis at Rystad Energy and a former OPEC official, said plainly, this move is unlikely to calm markets. It is a signal, not a solution. You can announce higher production, but if tankers face constraints in Hormuz, the physical market remains tight. The signal was received exactly as he predicted. Markets noted the OPEC Plus decision and kept going up anyway, because the problem was not production capacity. The problem was transit capacity. A no OPEC Plus announcement changes the drone threat environment over the Persian Gulf. Now, this is the moment in the story where we need to talk directly about MBS, about what Mohammed bin Salman actually is in this crisis. Because the version of this story being told in most Western media is incomplete, and the incomplete version misses the most important strategic dynamics at play. The narrative that MBS is simply a vulnerable ally, a client state leader sheltering under America's military umbrella while hoping the storm passes, is flatly wrong. It is a misreading of both the man and the moment. Here is who MBS actually is right now in March of 2026. He is, simultaneously, three things at once. He is a potential military target. Iran has already demonstrated willingness to strike Saudi energy infrastructure, and the Ras Tanura attack, regardless of its limited physical damage, was a signal that Iran can and will reach into the heart of Saudi Arabia's economic system if pushed hard enough. He is the custodian of the world's largest spare oil production capacity and its most critical energy export infrastructure, which gives him a degree of economic leverage over every major consuming nation on Earth that is nearly without parallel in the modern era. And he is the holder of functional diplomatic relationships with both Iran, through the Chinese brokered normalization agreement of 2023, and with Russia, through the OPEC Plus framework, that give him back-channel access and diplomatic reach that Washington simply does not have right now. He is a potential victim, a potential weapon, and a potential mediator. All three, at the same time. And he is using all three of those roles simultaneously in ways that are making American policymakers deeply uncomfortable. Let us look at what MBS actually did in the immediate aftermath of the Ras Tanura attack. He did not rush to Washington for security consultations. He did not hold a press conference condemning Iran in the language that Washington wanted. He used the Chinese brokered Saudi-Iranian diplomatic channel, the same channel that had been quietly reestablished 3 years earlier through Beijing's mediation, to send a dual-track message to Tehran. Track 1 was a warning. Saudi Arabia would defend its infrastructure and its sovereignty. Any further strikes on Saudi energy facilities would have consequences. Track 2 was something more nuanced and more alarming for Washington. MBS was signaling to Iran that Saudi Arabia had limits, that Saudi Arabia was not prepared to let its territory and its airspace become the forward operating base for the destruction of Iran's nuclear program, that the relationship between Riyadh and Washington, deep and long-standing as it was, did not extend to Saudi Arabia absorbing economic devastation as acceptable collateral damage in a war whose primary beneficiaries were Washington and Tel Aviv. This is the real meaning of the phrase, holding the global economy hostage, not the simplistic version that says Saudi Arabia is threatening to cut oil production unless the world does what it wants. The real hostage dynamic is more sophisticated and more dangerous than that. What MBS is holding is his cooperation, his strategic alignment, his willingness to keep Saudi Arabia firmly within the American orbit at a moment when China is actively courting Riyadh, when Russia is offering partnership through OPEC+, and when a growing number of developing nations are questioning whether the US-led global order still serves their interests. In a crisis of this magnitude, American dominance in the Gulf requires Saudi buy-in, requires Saudi airspace, requires Saudi intelligence cooperation, requires Saudi willingness to increase oil production to cushion the economic blow of a war that America initiated. And that buy-in, that cooperation, is not unconditional. It has a price. And MBS is currently in the process of determining what that price is in real time while the global economy bleeds. Consider what Saudi Arabia had actually done in the weeks before the strikes began. Saudi crude shipments had jumped to 3 million barrels per day in the first 24 days of February 2026, the highest level since April 2023. Riyadh had been quietly building up its production and export capacity in anticipation of American strikes on Iran. It had been positioning itself as the stabilizing swing producer, the reliable supplier that would step into the gap when Iranian supply was disrupted. This was coordinated, strategic, deliberate positioning. Saudi Arabia was not caught off guard by Operation Epic Fury. It was prepared. It had been preparing for weeks, and that preparation gave MBS a degree of readiness and leverage that a less strategically sophisticated leader might not have had. But here is what made the situation so much more complicated than any simple story of American ally and Iranian adversary. When the drones hit Ras Tanura, even if they were intercepted, the calculation in Riyadh shifted immediately. Because suddenly the question was no longer simply how to benefit from elevated oil prices in the aftermath of American strikes on Iran. The question became, at what point does cooperation with Washington's military campaign become an existential threat to Saudi Arabia's own economic foundations? At what point does the risk to Ras Tanura, to Abqaiq, to the entire energy infrastructure upon which Vision 2030 and Saudi Arabia's economic transformation depend, outweigh the benefits of alignment with the American position. These are not abstract questions. They are the most concrete questions imaginable when you are a leader who has built your entire domestic political legitimacy and your entire national development strategy on the premise that you can deliver economic growth and modernization to 35 million Saudis. If the oil infrastructure burns, Vision 2030 burns with it. And if Vision 2030 burns, MBS's position burns with it too. This is the structural reason why MBS cannot simply do whatever Washington asks, not because he is anti-American, not because he wants Iran to win, but because his own survival and his country's survival depend on him navigating this crisis with extraordinary care. And that navigation involves maintaining relationships and options that make Washington uncomfortable, but that are in Saudi Arabia's genuine strategic interest. Now, let us talk about the country that MBS is triangulating toward, because it is the most important piece of this entire geopolitical puzzle, and it is the piece that almost nobody in Western media is giving sufficient attention to: China. On March 4th, reports emerged that Iran had effectively announced it would allow only Chinese-owned vessels to transit the Strait of Hormuz. On March 5th, the bulk carrier Iron Maiden, operated by Cetus Maritime Shanghai Limited, transited the strait while broadcasting the signal "China owner." On March 7th, another bulk carrier, the Liberia-flagged Sino Ocean, broadcast its Chinese ownership status and successfully transited the strait to pick up cargo from the UAE. The IRGC confirmed on March 5th that the strait was closed only to ships from the United States, Israel, and their Western allies. This was not a military accident. This was a deliberate, calculated, strategic communication directed at one audience above all others: Beijing. Why China? Because China imports approximately 11 million barrels of oil per day, making it the world's largest oil importer. Around 40% of China's total oil imports pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Approximately 30% of China's LNG imports come from Qatar and the UAE. China purchases more than 80% of Iran's oil exports, providing Tehran with the financial lifeline it needs to sustain its government and its military through years of Western sanctions. The relationship between Beijing and Tehran is not simply diplomatic or ideological. It is deeply structural and mutually dependent. And when Iran decided to signal that Chinese vessels could pass safely while Western vessels could not, it was making a very specific geopolitical offer. The offer was this: China, you have leverage over Iran that nobody else has. You are our most important economic partner. Use that leverage to bring this conflict to an end, broker a deal, mediate a resolution. And, in exchange, your access to Gulf energy will be protected in ways that your Western competitors' access will not be. That offer puts China in an extraordinarily powerful position, and Beijing has responded with the careful, calculated precision that characterizes Chinese foreign policy at moments of maximum opportunity. Publicly, China has called for de-escalation and a ceasefire. Publicly, China has condemned the military strikes while carefully avoiding direct confrontation with Washington. But behind the scenes, Chinese diplomatic officials have been meeting with Iranian counterparts, with Saudi counterparts, and have been sending signals to Washington through back channels about the economic consequences Beijing believes are inevitable if this conflict is not resolved quickly. China has the relationships that nobody else has. China talks to Tehran. China talks to Riyadh. China talks to Moscow through the OPEC Plus framework. And China, unlike the United States at this particular moment, is not one of the parties to the military conflict. It has standing as a mediator that Washington and Tel Aviv cannot have. But understanding China's position requires understanding what China actually stands to gain and lose in this crisis. On the law side, China has enormous exposure. Roughly 40% of China's oil imports transit the Strait of Hormuz. 30% of its LNG comes from Qatar and the UAE. If those supply lines are disrupted for an extended period, China cannot simply switch overnight to alternative sources without accepting massive cost increases and supply gaps during the transition. China's LNG inventories as of late February 2026 stood at 6 million tons, providing some short-term buffer. But that buffer covers weeks, not months. And if a prolonged Hormuz closure forces China to compete with Europe and Japan for Atlantic LNG cargoes, prices across the entire Pacific basin tighten dramatically. And China's industrial cost base rises in ways that directly affect its manufacturing competitiveness, its employment stability, and its domestic political management. Xi Jinping does not want an energy crisis imported from the Persian Gulf landing on the desk of the Communist Party's domestic stability apparatus. That is a genuinely problematic scenario for Beijing, which is why China has strong material incentives to see this crisis resolved quickly and on terms that preserve Gulf energy infrastructure intact. On the gain side, China sees an opportunity that comes perhaps once in a generation: The United States has launched a major military campaign in the Middle East that is already straining its diplomatic relationships with its Gulf partners, revealing the limits of its ability to restore order even when it has overwhelming firepower on hand, and creating a vacuum of diplomatic influence into which China can step as the credible, willing, capable mediator. If China successfully brokers a ceasefire or even plays a visible constructive role in de-escalation, it achieves something that years of quiet economic diplomacy and infrastructure investment in the region have been building toward: the recognition by Gulf states and by the watching world that China is a legitimate great power with a legitimate role in Middle East security. That is enormously valuable to Beijing. And it is exactly what MBS wants too. Not because he is anti-American, but because a Middle East in which multiple great powers compete for influence is a Middle East in which Saudi Arabia has more options, more leverage, and more independence than a Middle East in which America's word is the only one that matters. And here is the dimension of this that matters most for where the world goes next. The price of Chinese mediation, the price that Beijing would extract for deploying its full diplomatic and economic leverage to bring Iran and the United States to a negotiating table, is not paid in money. It is paid in strategic recognition. In acknowledgement from Washington that China has a legitimate, permanent leading role in managing Middle East security, that the era of American unilateral dominance in the Gulf, the era that was built on the twin pillars of military supremacy and petrodollar dependency, is over, that the successor international order, whatever it looks like on the other side of this crisis, must include Chinese participation, Chinese buy-in, and Chinese interests. That is the price. And it is a price with implications for the global order that extend enormously far beyond oil prices and shipping lanes. This is the deeper story of the Hormuz crisis. Yes, it is a story about tankers and drones and oil prices and insurance markets. But underneath all of that, it is a story about a fundamental transition in the architecture of global power. The world that existed before February 28, 2026, was one in which American military and economic dominance in the Middle East, however strained and however contested, was still the organizing principle of the regional order. The world that is being created right now, in the crucible of this crisis, may be organized around different principles, and the countries whose choices will shape that new order most directly are not necessarily the ones fighting the war. They are Saudi Arabia, sitting at the intersection of every major energy, diplomatic, and financial flow in the region, and China, watching from a position of relative safety while the combatants exhaust themselves, holding the relationships and the leverage that may ultimately prove decisive. Now, let us bring the economic picture fully into focus, because the scale of what is happening to the global economy right now demands to be stated clearly and completely. The Strait of Hormuz closure is not an oil price event. No clear articulation of what terms Iran would accept to pull back from the strait, except perhaps through Saudi Arabia, except perhaps through China. And this is why the decisions MBS makes in the next few days matter so profoundly, because he may be the only actor in this crisis with genuine access to all parties simultaneously. He can talk to Washington. He can talk to Tehran through the Chinese brokered channel that survived even this crisis, however strained. He can talk to Beijing, which is watching and waiting for an invitation to play its mediating role more openly. And he has the economic credibility, as the only producer with meaningful spare capacity, as the custodian of Aramco, as the swing producer upon whose decisions global oil markets hang, to make any deal he brokers carry immediate economic weight. On March 7th, Iranian President Pezeshkian made a statement that was carefully worded and strategically significant. He said Iran did not seek war with its Gulf neighbors, that Iran had no desire to harm the people of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, or the UAE, and that Iran would refrain from further strikes on Gulf civilian and economic infrastructure, provided that the territory of those countries was not used as a staging ground for attacks against Iran. Notice the precision of that offer. It does not include stopping the Strait of Hormuz operation. It does not include any concession on Iran's military posture or nuclear program. What it offers is an off-ramp specifically for the Gulf states, a path by which Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Bahrain, and Kuwait can reduce their exposure to Iranian retaliation by signaling, not publicly, perhaps, but credibly and privately, that they will limit their cooperation with the American military campaign to a level that Iran finds tolerable. Saudi Arabia's foreign ministry response to that statement was extraordinary in its diplomatic precision. Riyadh reiterated its commitment to defending its sovereignty. It reiterated its support for a diplomatic resolution to the Iran nuclear issue. It expressed its concern for regional stability, and it did not endorse the American military campaign. It did not condemn it either. The statement was, in the language of diplomacy, perfectly balanced. Designed to close no doors. Designed to preserve every option. designed to allow MBS maximum maneuverability at a moment when maneuverability is the most valuable strategic asset anyone possesses. Here is what all of this means for the three scenarios that serious analysts are now mapping. The first is rapid de-escalation, a ceasefire framework, brokered through some combination of Saudi and Chinese diplomatic effort, allows Iran to claim it deterred a full assault on its sovereignty and inflicted genuine economic pain on its enemies, allows the United States and Israel to claim Iran's nuclear program has been significantly degraded, allows the Strait to reopen as part of a negotiated arrangement. Oil prices fall back toward $80 or $90. The global economy takes a severe but survivable hit. The underlying tensions are unresolved, but the acute crisis passes. This is what markets want. This is what every finance minister on earth is calling for. And as of March 9th, this is still the scenario that most analysts assign the highest probability. Not because the path there is obvious or easy, but because the consequences of not reaching it are consequences that multiple powerful actors are highly motivated to avoid. The second scenario is prolonged standoff. Neither side backs down fully. The military campaign continues at reduced intensity. Iran maintains the threat environment in the Strait without continuously escalating. Insurance coverage slowly, partially returns as the immediate intensity of the attacks decreases. Oil stays elevated for months. Some producing countries exhaust storage capacity and are forced to cut production temporarily. The global economy absorbs the shock at great cost. Developing nations in South Asia and Africa enter genuine economic crises. Political instability follows. The petrodollar order weakens further. Chinese influence in the region grows. American credibility is damaged in ways that take years to repair. This scenario requires no dramatic escalation and no dramatic de-escalation. It just requires the current situation to persist, which, given the complexity of the diplomatic environment and the number of actors with conflicting interests, is entirely plausible. The third scenario is the one that every responsible analyst includes in their models while hoping with genuine intensity that it never materializes. Escalation. A strike on Ras Tanura that is not intercepted this time. A decision by Iran, backed against an existential wall, to move from drone harassment of shipping to the systematic destruction of Gulf energy infrastructure. A U.S. Navy convoy operation in the Strait that triggers a direct naval engagement with IRGC forces. A miscalculation by any of the many armed parties operating in an extremely compressed, extremely tense, extremely information-saturated operational environment. If this scenario unfolds, if Ras Tanura burns in earnest, if the world's largest oil processing facility at Abqaiq is struck the way it was in 2019, but this time without the containment that limited the 2019 attack's duration, then the numbers that analysts are quietly calculating in their models will become public conversation. And those numbers describe a world where oil above $150 is not the peak, but the baseline, where global recession is not a risk, but a certainty, and where the cascading financial effects, the margin calls, the fund liquidations, the credit market freezes, amplify the underlying supply disruption into something that looks less like the 2008 financial crisis and more like the kind of systemic economic shock that changes the trajectory of nations for a generation. This is the weight of what 21 miles of water is carrying right now. This is the arithmetic of the Hormuz crisis. This is why the decisions made in Riyadh over the next 72 hours, the calls MBS makes, the signals he sends, the price he names for his cooperation, the role he chooses to play, matter to every single person on Earth who fills a gas tank, pays an electricity bill, buys groceries, holds a pension fund, or relies on a global supply chain to stock the shelves of the stores they shop in. The world has been to moments like this before. Not exactly this moment. Not these precise actors, these precise weapons, these precise dependencies, but moments where a narrow passage, a critical resource, a handful of decisions by a handful of leaders brought the entire architecture of the global economy to a point of maximum fragility. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The oil embargo of 1973, when Arab oil producers cut off supply to the United States and its allies and triggered the first modern global energy crisis, quadrupling oil prices within months and sending economic shockwaves through every industrialized nation on Earth. The tanker war of the 1980s, when the United States found itself escorting Kuwaiti oil, tankers through the Persian Gulf under its own flag, protecting them from Iranian attack during the Iran-Iraq conflict. The Gulf War of 1990, when Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait temporarily removed 2 million barrels per day from global markets and triggered a recession. And after every single one of those crises, the world spent years and decades gradually forgetting the lesson it had just been taught, that the global economy's dependence on a handful of narrow waterways and vulnerable surface installations for the energy that runs everything is not a manageable background risk. It is a structural vulnerability that, when it activates, can destabilize the financial foundations of nations that have never fired a weapon and have no direct stake in the political conflict that caused the disruption. What is different this time, what makes this crisis more dangerous than any previous episode of Hormuz tension, is the convergence of factors that have no historical precedent as a combined package. Iran has never before succeeded in effectively shutting down commercial navigation through the Strait using an insurance-driven mechanism that requires no physical blockade and costs a fraction of what defending against it costs. The OPEC Plus system creates coordination dynamics among producing nations that did not exist in earlier crises, and that make any attempted market stabilization response more complicated. The Chinese factor, China's enormous energy import dependence, its financial exposure to Gulf producers, its diplomatic relationships with all parties simultaneously, and its generational ambition to be recognized as a legitimate global security manager alongside the United States, is genuinely new terrain. China's role in any resolution of this crisis will be qualitatively different from any role it has played in any previous Middle East episode. And the nature of the weapons most central to the Strait's effective closure, cheap, mass-produced drones that cost a small fraction of what a single oil tanker is worth, operated by forces that are dispersed, mobile, and nearly impossible to fully neutralize from the air without a comprehensive campaign vastly larger than what is currently underway, represents a military technological reality that fundamentally breaks the historical logic of American deterrence in the Persian Gulf region. For 3 decades, the standard deterrence logic ran as follows. The United States has overwhelming military superiority in the Gulf region. Iran knows it cannot win a direct military confrontation with America. Therefore, Iran will not push beyond certain limits because the consequences of doing so would be too severe. That logic has now been empirically tested and found to be incomplete. Not because Iran has defeated the United States militarily. It has not. It will not. But because military defeat was never Iran's objective. Iran's objective is to make the economic cost of attacking it so high, so broadly distributed, so deeply felt across so many countries and economies, that the political calculation shifts in Washington, in Tel Aviv, and in the capitals of every country whose economy is being harmed by the current situation. And that objective is being achieved not through military victory on any conventional battlefield, but through the relentless application of cheap, asymmetric pressure on the single most vulnerable node in the entire global economic system. The world that existed before February 28th, 2026 was imperfect, contested, unequal, and in many ways fragile, but it was organized around certain recognizable principles. American military primacy in the Gulf, dollar-denominated energy trade, Gulf monarchies as strategic partners whose security Washington guaranteed and whose energy Washington depended upon. Those principles are now being tested simultaneously and severely. And the outcome of this test, which principles survive, which are modified, which are discarded entirely, and what new principles replace them, will determine the shape of the international order, not just for the remainder of this decade, but for the one that follows it. Right now, 150 tankers sit at anchor in the Persian Gulf, waiting. Iraq has cut production by 1.5 million barrels per day because its storage tanks are full and there is nowhere to send the oil. Insurance companies have withdrawn coverage from the most important energy corridor on Earth. 3 vessel crossings were recorded through the entire Strait of Hormuz on March 7th. 3. On a waterway that in normal times handles dozens of transits daily carrying energy that lights up cities from Tokyo to Frankfurt to Karachi to Sao Paulo. The tanker Prima was struck by an Iranian drone in the Strait on March 7th. The tugboat Musafa II, dispatched to assist a previously struck vessel, was hit by 2 missiles on March 6th and sank, leaving crew members missing. Every day that this continues, the economic damage compounds. Every day that Gulf storage tanks fill further toward capacity limits, the threat of forced production shutdowns grows more acute. Every day that Asian economies absorb higher energy costs, the downstream effects on manufacturing, employment, and social stability become more deeply embedded and harder to reverse. MBS is on the phone. Beijing is watching and calculating and waiting for exactly the right moment to make its move. The markets are pricing in scenarios that economic textbooks say should not be possible in the modern interconnected world. And the man in the White House is waiting for his generals to tell him whether the U.S. Navy can escort enough oil tankers through a drone-threatened 21-mile-wide waterway to keep the global economy from tipping over the edge, while simultaneously running a major air campaign against a nation of 90 million people that has been planning for precisely this moment for decades, and that has demonstrated, with ruthless and unmistakable efficiency, that it does not need to win a military exchange to impose devastating economic consequences on every nation that chose to support, enable, or simply tolerate the strikes that began this crisis. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. The shipping lanes within it are 2 miles wide in each direction. Through those 2 miles, in normal times, flows the energy that sustains the lives and livelihoods of billions of people who have never heard its name. The decisions that determine whether those lanes reopen And when, and on what terms, and at what price, and with what acknowledgement of whose interests now matter and whose no longer do, are being made right now in rooms that most of us will never enter, by people who are carrying a weight that history does not often ask human beings to carry. The storage tanks are filling. The tankers are anchored, the insurance markets are closed, the economic clock is running, and the whole world is watching, and the whole world is waiting. And what MBS decides, and what Beijing decides, and what Washington decides, and whether any of them can step far enough back from the logic of the moment to see what they are building or destroying. That is what will determine whether the Strait of Hormuz becomes a footnote in the history of a crisis that was averted just in time, or whether it becomes the defining event of a decade in which the global order finally, irreversibly, shifted.